Oliver Sterling was a man who lived entirely on the surface of things. At 34, he was the youngest senior appraiser of European antiquities at Crofton Kensington, New York's most ruthlessly elite auction house. He was impeccably dressed, terrifyingly articulate, and completely hollow. To Oliver, art was not an expression of the human soul, it was a metric. It was an asset class, a tax haven for billionaires, a series of brushstrokes to be authenticated, appraised, and locked away in a climate-controlled vault in Geneva. He spent his days authenticating the passions of dead men for the benefit of living sociopaths. As a result, Oliver had developed a severe, crippling case of psychological anhedonia. The world had lost its texture. Food tasted like ash. Relationships felt like transactional networking, and the magnificent oil canvases he handled daily might as well have been printed on sterile wallpaper. He was a man starving to death at a banquet, desperate for a single drop of something authentic. In the bleak, slate-gray month of November, Oliver was dispatched to the Hudson Valley. His assignment was the Ashford Estate, a decaying, Gilded Age monstrosity built in 1890 by a reclusive industrialist. The last heir had recently died, leaving behind a sprawling, tax-delinquent manor, rumored to hold a trove of forgotten Victorian masterpieces. The environment mirrored Oliver's internal desolation. As his sleek black Audi navigated the winding, neglected driveway, the ancient skeletal oaks seemed to claw at the low-hanging fog. The estate itself was a monument to rot. The stonework was choked with black ivy, and the massive bay windows stared out at the overgrown grounds like the dead, clouded eyes of a leviathan. The executor of the estate, a nervous local attorney, handed Oliver the heavy brass keys and quickly retreated, unnerved by the oppressive silence of the manor. Oliver was left alone to document the ruins. For 3 days, Oliver worked in the freezing, drafty rooms, cataloging tarnished silver and moth-eaten tapestries. The isolation was absolute. The silence of the house was so profound it generated a ringing in his ears. On the afternoon of the 4th day, as a violent freezing rain began to lash against the glass, Oliver unlocked the heavy mahogany doors of the West Conservatory. The room was vast, circular, and entirely dominated by a massive object leaning against the far wall, draped in heavy, dust-caked canvas. The air in the conservatory was different. It didn't smell of dry rot and mice, but possessed a strange, heavy humidity. It smelled faintly of crushed fern, wet loam, and ozone. Oliver pulled the canvas tarp down. The cloud of dust momentarily blinded him, but as it settled, he found himself staring at a masterpiece that instantly paralyzed his breath. It was a colossal oil painting, at least 10 feet tall and 15 feet wide, enclosed in a heavily tarnished, gilded frame. It was clearly a product of the late Pre-Raphaelite movement, but it possessed a terrifying, hyper-realistic vibrancy that defied the century it must have spent in darkness. The composition depicted a dense sylvan glade caught in the bruised purple light of eternal twilight. Towering, ancient willow trees wept over a dark, glass-still pool of water. Dispersed throughout the glade were several women, nymphs or muses, dressed in flowing, diaphanous silk. They were gathering pale, luminous flowers. The technical execution was impossible. The impasto, the thick layering of the paint, was so masterful that the bark of the trees looked rough enough to scrape the skin from a knuckle. But it was the psychological gravity of the painting that anchored Oliver to the floorboards. His eyes were drawn to the bottom right corner of the canvas, standing slightly apart from the other figures, half shadowed by a weeping willow, was a girl. She was devastatingly beautiful, with pale skin and heavy dark pre-Raphaelite curls. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, but it was her face that shattered Oliver's cynical armor. Her mouth was parted in a half-formed, desperate sigh, and her eyes, painted with an impossible depth of dark umber and gold, were looking directly out of the canvas. She was not looking at a conceptual viewer. She was looking at Oliver. Her expression was a master class in forbidden, tragic emotion. It was a look of profound yearning, of agonizing loneliness, and of an intense, magnetic invitation. "My God," Oliver whispered, his voice cracking in the empty room. He stepped closer, his analytical mind scrambling to identify the artist. There was no signature. But as he stood inches from the canvas, the environmental dread of the manor faded, replaced by an intoxicating sensory overload. The painting seemed to pulse. He could swear he saw the bruised purple light of the painted sky shift. The smell of wet loam and night-blooming jasmine suddenly overpowered the scent of the dusty room. He reached out a trembling gloved hand, tracing the air millimeters from the painted girl's face. He felt a sudden, distinct drop in temperature, a cool breeze that seemed to originate from behind the varnish. Oliver did not leave the conservatory that night. He brought his camping lantern, his thermos of coffee, and a folding chair, sitting directly in front of the canvas. The modern, curated world of auction houses and spreadsheets completely evaporated. He was entirely consumed by the girl in the corner. He named her Genevieve in his mind. He imagined her voice. He projected all of his starved, desperate need for authenticity onto her two-dimensional form. She is trapped, he thought, his sanity slowly fracturing under the psychological weight of the isolation and the hypnotic pull of the art. She is trapped in the oil, waiting for someone who can actually see her. Outside, the storm intensified. Thunder rattled the thick glass of the conservatory windows. The camping lantern flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, save for the intermittent, blinding flashes of lightning. During one massive, localized thunderclap, Oliver jumped to his feet. The lightning illuminated the canvas in a stark, blue-white glare. Genevieve had moved. Her hand, previously resting at her side, was now raised. Her pale, painted fingers were pressed flat against the inside of the varnish, right where Oliver had been hovering his hand hours before. A rational man would have fled. A rational man would have run into the freezing rain and never looked back. But Oliver Sterling was a starving man, and he had finally found a feast. He stepped forward until the toes of his expensive Italian leather shoes touched the gilded frame. He slowly raised his bare hand, his heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He pressed his palm directly against the canvas, aligning it with Genevieve's painted hand. The texture was not dry, cracked oil paint. It was warm. It yielded. A sudden, terrifying sensation of weightlessness seized Oliver's body. It felt as though his bones had turned to mist and his blood to mercury. The canvas did not break. It enveloped him. The heavy smell of jasmine and wet earth surged into his lungs, choking him. The sound of the thunderstorm was instantly muted, replaced by the soft, rustling sound of wind through 1,000 willow branches. Oliver fell forward, tumbling through the membrane of the painting. He crashed onto his hands and knees, gasping for air. His palms sank deep into damp, fragrant moss. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, his mind violently rejecting the physical impossibility of what had just occurred. "You took so long," a voice whispered. It was a voice like wind moving across fine silk, soft, ancient, and heartbreakingly real. Oliver opened his eyes. He was no longer in the dusty conservatory of the Ashford Estate. He was kneeling in the twilight glade. The sky above him was a swirling, bruised canopy of indigo and violet, glowing with an internal, ethereal light. The willow trees towered over him, their leaves a vibrant, impossible shade of green, and kneeling right in front of him, her emerald silk dress pooling on the moss, was Genevieve. She was life-sized. She was real. Her pale skin radiated a soft warmth, and the dark umber and gold eyes were filled with tears. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the sharp line of Oliver's jaw. Her touch sent a shock wave of pure, unadulterated electricity through his nervous system. "You can see me," she breathed, her lips trembling. "All these years, men have looked at the frame. They looked at the price. But you looked at me." Oliver, the cynical appraiser, the man who had monetized beauty, began to weep. The psychological dam broke. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the heavy, jessamine-scented curls of her hair. He felt her heart beat against his chest, frantic, fluttering, and agonizingly authentic. He forgot his name. He forgot New York. He forgot the modern world. Here, in the eternal twilight, he was fully, authentically alive. She took his hand and led him away from the dark pool, deeper into the painted forest. The other nymphs did not look at them. They were frozen in a terrifying repetitive loop, endlessly gathering the same luminous flowers, their faces blank and vacant. But Genevieve was awake. They lay together beneath the heavy boughs of an ancient oak tree. The experience was a sensory explosion. Every touch, every breath, every whispered word felt magnified 1,000 times. Oliver experienced a purity of emotion that modern reality could never offer. It was a romantic immersion so deep, so consuming, that it bypassed his intellect entirely and bonded directly to his soul. He didn't know if he was there for an hour, a day, or a lifetime. Time in the glade was a stagnant puddle. Eventually, Oliver fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, wrapped in the emerald silk of Genevieve's gown. When he woke, the atmosphere of the glade had violently shifted. The bruised purple twilight had curdled into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The air, previously fragrant with jasmine, now smelled sharply of turpentine, rotting linseed oil, and burning hair. Oliver sat up, the damp moss cold against his skin. Genevieve was gone. "Genevieve," he called out, panic instantly spiking in his chest. His voice didn't echo. It was swallowed by the dense, oppressive trees. He scrambled to his feet, running through the glade toward the dark pool where he had first arrived. The looping nymphs were gone. The forest felt hostile, predatory. The vibrant greens of the leaves had turned to an oxidized, poisonous copper. At the edge of the pool, a figure stood waiting for him. It was a woman, dressed in a severe, high-collared, Victorian gown of pitch black. Her face was a brutal, sharp-angled mirror of Genevieve's, the same features but twisted into an expression of profound aristocratic malice. Her eyes were not umber and gold. They were solid, glossy black, like spilled ink. In her gloved hand she held a long, thin riding crop made of braided leather. Oliver froze. The primal terror he had felt before touching the canvas came rushing back, amplified by the vulnerability of his exposed soul. "Who are you?" Oliver demanded, trying to project a non-existent authority. "Where is Genevieve?" The woman in black laughed. It was a horrific sound, the sound of a palette knife scraping violently across dry canvas. "Genevieve," the woman sneered, her voice dripping with aristocratic contempt. "The little lure, the bait for the lonely, starving men of the real world. She loves me," Oliver spat, the words feeling utterly true to his broken heart. "She brought me here. She brought you here to feed us, you pathetic little tourist," the woman hissed. She stepped forward, the sickly yellow light casting long, demonic shadows across her face. "Do you know who painted this, Oliver? Victor Ashford. He didn't use pigment for the shadows. He used his own madness. He used the marrow of his own bones. This is not a sanctuary. This is a stomach." The psychological horror of the trap slammed into Oliver with the force of a freight train. The authenticity he had craved, the deep emotional resonance he had found with Genevieve, was nothing but the beautiful, glowing lure of a deep-sea anglerfish. He had offered up the very core of his soul, and the painting was digesting it. "Get out of my glade," the woman commanded, raising the leather crop. "No," Oliver shouted, stepping backward toward the pool. "I'm not leaving without her." The woman's arm lashed forward with blinding speed. The leather crop cracked like a gunshot. The physical pain was immediate, excruciating, and completely unnatural. The whip struck Oliver across the chest, tearing through his shirt and biting deep into his flesh. But it didn't just cut his skin. It felt as though it had slashed through the very fabric of his consciousness. He screamed, falling backward into the dark, still water of the pool, but there was no splash. The water hardened instantly into a solid, impenetrable sheet of dried varnish. The painted sky above him warped, twisted, and shattered like broken glass. Oliver felt himself violently, agonizingly squeezed through space no wider than an atom. The smell of turpentine filled his lungs, choking him. He hit a hard, wooden surface with bone-shattering force. Oliver gasped, his eyes flying open. He was lying on his back on the dusty, cold floorboards of the West Conservatory in the Ashford Estate. The gray light of dawn was filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The storm had passed. He was back in the real world. He rolled onto his side, coughing violently, inhaling the familiar, dead smell of dry rot and dust. His chest burned with a blinding agony. He tore his shirt open. Running diagonally across his sternum was a deep, weeping laceration, a perfect, bloody mirror of a whip strike. Trembling, weeping in pain and profound, world-ending grief, Oliver slowly pulled himself up to a kneeling position and looked at the massive canvas. The painting was exactly as he had first found it, the eternal twilight, the weeping willows, the looping nymphs, and in the bottom right corner, standing in the shadows, was Genevieve. Her emerald gown was pristine. Her dark curls were perfect. But as Oliver looked at her face, his heart shattered completely. She was no longer looking at him with desperate yearning. She was no longer inviting him in. Genevieve's painted face bore an expression of absolute hollow sorrow. A single perfectly rendered tear, a drop of glossy white lead paint, rested on her pale cheek. She was looking past Oliver, staring out into the empty, dusty room, waiting for the next lonely, starving man to walk through the door, and standing directly behind her, partially obscured by the painted willow trunk, was a shadow that hadn't been there before. The faint, dark outline of a woman holding a riding crop. Oliver Sterling never returned to Crofton, Kensington. He abandoned his Audi his tailored suits, and his entire curated life. He sent a brief, erratic email to his superiors resigning his position, claiming he had suffered a severe nervous breakdown. The Ashford Estate was eventually sold to a developer. The art collection was auctioned off. The massive, unsigned pre-Raphaelite canvas, dubbed the Nymphs of Lethe by the auction house, was sold to a private collector in Dubai for an undisclosed, record-breaking sum. Oliver moved to a small, sun-bleached town in the arid deserts of New Mexico. He took a job sweeping floors in a local hardware store. He surrounded himself with the harshest, most barren reality he could find. He lived in a world of blinding sun, dry cacti, and simple, transactional conversations. He never looked at a painting again. He threw out every photograph, every magazine, every piece of printed media in his small apartment, because Oliver knew the terrifying truth. He knew that the modern world was hollow, yes, but he also knew that the only place he had ever felt truly, authentically alive was inside a trap designed to consume him. He was a man who had touched heaven only to discover it was a slaughterhouse, and every night when he took his shirt off in the dark, he would run his fingers over the thick raised scar on his chest. It never fully healed. It constantly seeped a clear, viscous fluid that smelled faintly, sickeningly, of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine.